Good morning, Mayor Rogers.
Good morning.
I think that's everyone.
It is.
Oh, you know what? Jesse's not on. Let me just try to find Jesse and then we can start. Sorry, Jesse's our first item. And he said he could be here. There he is.
All right, well, we get Jesse moved over. Let's go ahead and call to order. Madam Recording Secretary, can you call the roll?
Absolutely. Member Fleming.
Present. Good morning.
Good morning. Member Sawyer.
Here, thank you.
And Mayor Rogers.
Here.
Let the record reflect that the subcommittee is present. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll start with public comment for non-agenda items. If you have a comment on something within the Economic Development Subcommittee's jurisdiction, but not on today's agenda, go ahead and hit the raise hand feature.
I see that we have Mr. Frazier. It'll just take me one moment to get that screen up. Mr. Frazier, you have been given permission to speak. If you would just confirm your ability to see the screen in 1 second. I apologize, it's a little bit of a delay. All right, you should be able to see that now.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can see the screen, and good morning to everybody. We were disappointed that there wasn't a subcommittee meeting last. The last meeting was canceled. And of course, that's important because short-term rentals are on everybody's mind. It's not lost on us that the promised public processes and public hearings connected with a robust planning process, a robust and legal planning process that was promised in the spring of 2022 did not happen, failed to materialize. And we do have some questions about that. We also have questions about why staff continues to use defective information in its presentations. The level of propaganda and misinformation really does nothing to solve any issues. It actually camouflages the real issues. And it does have a negative effect and impact in our community, in our neighborhoods, because the city, by using incorrect information and straying from the truth, gives shelter to people that feel that they can terrorize their neighbors, their short-term rental owning neighbors and their guests. And while there's very little factually when it comes to the complaint basis, after all, one of the council members in this meeting solicited over 100 complaints from one vexatious complainer about defective advertisements and whatnot. That's the type of stuff that we see in authoritarian governments. It's not the stuff that we value in a transparent democracy. So there's a lot of defects going on there when it comes to your strategy. And I'm not exactly sure what your motives are. It's like the motives don't really matter, I suppose. I thank you very much for approving our non-hosted application. Thank you. That just means that our house will probably be a non-hosted STR for decades. Why would we want to change that? By creating STR regulations, you're creating a sense of scarcity and not only hyping fear, but you're really making a huge mistake. the civil rights abuses are amazing and really probably going to be the basis of our research going forward. The psychological warfare is really interesting, and I can see that's coming from trained psychological experts in the psychological sciences. But it's really, it all boils down to these incredible civil rights violations of creating racist fear against visitors and attacking property owners because they differ with your ideology. So we'll see what happens tonight. Thank you very much.
There are no additional hands raised at this time.
All right, let's go on to item 3.1 then.
And so Jesse is going to actually start this off, but we have promoted a couple other people and then more when they come on. But Cadence and Tara are here with me as well, because between these two items, the 3.1 and 3.2, we want to just sort of have a flowing conversation about the opportunities. But we're starting with this with Jesse, because we get a lot of questions about tenant improvements as a means by which to open and quickly get businesses up and running or to change things. So Jesse, I'm going to hand it over to you, and then we're going to sort of flow into the next conversation as well.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Raisa, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So Raisa and I had a couple discussions about some of these inquiries that she's been getting and the chamber's been getting, and the real interest in what can we do from our perspective to really assist the businesses, and really from what my perspective is really re-tenanting spaces. That's a pretty common occurrence in the downtown area and elsewhere. And our target for the discussion today is really the primary ones in the areas of concern is office, retail, and restaurant. And I just want to add that what we're wanting to do won't just specifically be for those. We'll have discussions a little bit later about what we want to discuss and how we want to approach it, being citywide, literally. Because there's no reason that our approaches can't be utilized in any sector, any type of business or manufacturing. So for applicants or folks that are just maybe considering moving into a business space, they always have these questions on what do I need a permit for? And part of our goal is going to be lining out and giving real clear guidance on what really triggers, and that was a key word used, what triggers us having to not in a bad way deal with the city and getting permits. So I'll run through some of the things that we know in our department, and those that don't deal with this, they really have no way of knowing. One of the key things is if somebody wants to re-tenant a space, if it works for them and what they're going to propose the new use as, if it was that before and what they're going to do is very similar or the same, that's the easiest path. You don't technically need even a building permit for that. And that doesn't mean that someone can't come into a tenant space, and I'll use, say, a retail, which we see quite a lot of re-tenanting. If something was a retail, what we call a mercantile before, and someone wants to move into that mercantile, but they don't like the way it looks, they want to freshen it up, so to speak. They want to do new finishes, paint, new flooring, things like that. To a pretty high level, that type of work doesn't even require permits. And we're always willing to talk people through what that means. And I hope that my approach to manage really adjudicating the building codes is that I hope it's known that I look for the easiest path and try to other regulators wouldn't like me to hear me say this, but I help to find exemptions. I try to find a way so people don't have to do X, Y, or Z. That's pretty contrary to normal regulatory approaches. But why do we want to regulate something if it really doesn't have to, and legally, and we aren't required to, and everything can be done safely. So that's our real goal, is safe and healthy occupancy. So that's really, we wanted to develop some guidance, and it's fairly straightforward on what that means. Somebody wants to re-tenant a space and they don't have to even deal with us, other than getting a very straightforward, what we call a zoning clearance. That's a planning approval that says you can do what you're proposing to do, where you're proposing to do it, and then that business tax certificate. That's the easiest ground level. Then we really start getting into those, what we deem triggers. If someone needs to move in and re-tenant, say an office, retail, or restaurant, and they propose making physical changes to the building, that's where the state codes, the state laws, they kind of require us to open the book, so to speak. And every time we have to open that book, the biggest, scariest component always tends to be accessibility. A lot of people refer to it as ADA. That is the federal term here in California. It is California accessibility, very synonymous. That's the scariest, tends to be the scariest part for folks when they say, I want to move in here, but am I going to be required to upgrade all the ADA stuff? That's where it starts getting a little more ambiguous, a little more cloudy on how it's applied. And it does, if somebody wants to make physical changes to any commercial building, with some exceptions, technically they're required to obtain the services of a licensed design professional. Typically that's a licensed architect, licensed civil engineer, licensed structural engineer, one or all of those. And then that starts creating the anxiety of costs. You see hiring those additional folks, and it starts, really building up the cost to just try and get into a space. We try to limit that as much as possible. We will pre-meet with anybody that has a proposal on a drawing, and we'll give them guidance. And then again, we do have developed some guidance for tenant improvements, but we can do a better job at targeting this perspective on the new business owner that wants to re-tenant, relocate, to give them a little more of a clear idea and say a decision chart on what they may or may not have to do. Again, back to the scary thing that tends to be the accessibility. That's where costs really start coming into play. And of course, we have a pretty old downtown, and it becomes even more challenging with it's always much more challenging with existing buildings. So that's where we have those design professionals and our team talk about what they propose doing. And then there's this other term that we have. It's a trigger, but it's a legal threshold in the codes that says, if you spend this much, if you're proposing to do this physical change to the building, and it's going to cost you X, up to a certain amount, you have to spend 20% on top of that to make these additional upgrades to accessibility. So that's really where it starts, hurting the bottom line for a re-tenanting. Is someone with a business proposal may have all of their costs. They've maybe even gotten bids for construction and have talked to a contractor, and they know what their costs are going to be. Say it's fairly significant, say approaching $200,000, which doesn't take long to get there these days. We all know construction cost wise. Well, if you approach that amount, say $200,000, you have to add another almost $40,000 you have to add to this pot of money that you are required by law to spend on additional accessibility upgrades. And unfortunately, again, due to the age of so many buildings that may have been tenanted for very low turnover for a period of time, those tenants weren't required to do any upgrades in the eyes of California law for many, many years. So now we're faced with this old building that has a lot of work that we have to do. We do have the ability, there's forms that we can work with applicants and their professionals that give us the allowance to say, okay, there's a term called unreasonable hardship. The technical requirement really is, the code says, if you're going to move in and make changes, make everything accessible 100%. Then we get into these exceptions. So that's really where the clouds start coming over the process, and people really not understanding and knowing what it really means when they have to re-tenant a space. And we unfortunately are in the difficult situation of having to deliver the news that not only do you have to do this work, you have to do that too. So that's the real difficult point. The other physical changes, typically, we don't run into too many problems, especially these types of occupancies. Restaurants are their own animal, and if somebody's going to do a restaurant, that comes with its own real challenges with the food preparation, health department, sanitary disposal, those kinds of things. But those are not that, the projects themselves typically aren't that overly complicated. Unless somebody's just going to do a complete, redo of the inside of an entire building. So then it starts getting complicated, but again, it's all confined within the code. So again, kind of 3 different levels. There's we're going to do nothing physical that requires a permit. We're going to do a few things. We can work through a few small things that they may have to do. And then there's the big one that really it's a lot of money going into it, a lot of extra money that has to cover these accessibility costs. And then working with our team and our teams, we're very fortunate to have some really experienced code professionals, and we're adding another one. I'm so happy to announce, first time in 14 years, new plan checker coming on board. So the team's always ready to meet with folks, meet at the counter, look at a conceptual plan, give feedback, give them some options. And sometimes that can be multiple trips. We can talk to them about their plan. We give them a bunch of feedback. They go back and talk to maybe their contractor, a draftsperson, design professional, and then they find out, they start doing dollars. They'll come back and say, you know what, that was going to cost us too much. Let's scale it down. If we do this, what do we really have to do then? So we'll work with them on every occasion to do that. I've rambled for quite some time with a lot of information. And again, most of the focus was on that accessibility component, which from my perspective seems to be the biggest, scariest part. And then next, I'm sure we'll want to talk about, so this process, we make it well known, we can meet with folks. How do we execute it rather quickly? And as everybody's been living through this whole crazy COVID world, we've gone totally digital. I just shared with Raisa yesterday, I have a brilliant plan check engineer that I've posed the question to several times to our plan check group. And I said, how in the world are we going to do this over the counter, which we used to do exceptionally well? How do we do an over the counter plan review and send somebody out with their permit? The electronic world is everybody, we work with everybody electronically. They send us plans, we review them, and then we send them back electronically, go back and forth. We don't have that face-to-face. So we do have a plan to move forward on a pseudo over the counter, literally within a day or two turnaround for projects that can qualify. In other words, they're something that we can do within a reasonable amount of time in a single day and get things taken care of. So I'm going to stop talking. I spouted a whole bunch of stuff off and give everybody a chance to pick my little gray matter if needed.
And I know that, John, you have a question, but I want to also go back after we answer some questions and just sort of frame this as the foundation for the next conversation so it can broaden the issues as well.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Thanks, Mayor, and thanks, Raisa. I'm curious, Jesse, in your literature that you might be handing out to prospective tenants or tenants that are looking to do some improvements, do you also have a conversation with the tenant, unless they own the building, about having a conversation with the landlords about sharing costs, especially with ADA improvements? And because that is an ADA improvement is a long-term investment in a building, and it lives with the building as long as the building is there, and that landlord is going to benefit from that change. Do you make those kind of recommendations? Have you had a conversation? Do you ask the tenant? Have you had a conversation with your landlord? Do you go there?
Very sparingly from a legal perspective. We do not get into financials or ownership or things like those, but we do have that conversation. And I'll give a real good example of something that will probably illustrate your question. Picture a strip mall that has, say, 10 tenant spaces, and the new slushy shop wants to go into one of these spaces. And their lease typically, as most of you know, especially you, John, is that their lease space is limited to the confines of their walls. Well, the laws are going to tell us that if you go in and do all these changes that require permits, you're also going to have to do work outside that is under landlord control, say parking space improvements, other improvements outside the building. So that really lends itself to that discussion. And we tend to really try to avoid being that middle person between a tenant and a landlord. We will, when say a tenant says, well, that's not in my lease, that's when we say, well, let's get your landlord involved. You have a very good point, but we do, and again, I'll say from the legal perspective, we have to be extremely careful when we say you should do this or you should do that, especially when it comes to private negotiations on leases and those kinds of things. But we do let people know it is something that will need to be worked out between you and your landlord, or vice versa. And a lot of times we can actually work out deals in that example that I used, that one tenant space, lease confined to the space, and the tenant is just specifically saying, I can only pull a permit for this. We'll say, okay, well, we'll talk to your landlord and let them know that this is a requirement of this permit. And if they want to pull a separate permit, so you guys are separated, we'll do that. That way we're still complying with the law to meet those requirements. So I hope that answers some of your question.
It does. Thank you.
So, pulling this back out a little bit in terms of, this is a little bit, when I put the agenda together, it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog in terms of, like, we knew sort of generally when I put it together what we wanted to talk about, or what are the issues that come to the city in terms of the time, cost, and certainty issues around everything from small business to large business. But the crux of the issue that Jesse's sort of saying, pointing out that we have multiple ways to kind of address it. It comes from, let me stop. What I'm interested in for the discussion today, it goes into the next one as well, is incentives. And we have issues from small to large in terms of how are we addressing some of these things. In the day-to-day business, I think we get the most questions in economic development about tenant improvements, about ease and speed of getting your business up and running. And generally they're the small businesses. So we looked preliminarily to try to address this with the ARPA funds. So Tara and Raphael are working on the facade improvement program and the mural program for small businesses to try to aid them. But the thing that was interesting is we went first and foremost after a tenant improvement program, realizing after we were looking at that it's far too complicated, and the restrictions, mostly the time constraints around the ARPA funds, would make that very difficult. So we're throwing out sort of like, or I want to open up the question of incentives in this sort of super preliminary discussion that's going to be kind of messy, to help us understand moving forward what might be of interest to the council. And to make it more complicated, so we have developers coming in on one hand, and they're building things and having issues with recruiting, and a lot of times that comes down to tenant improvements and the cost that's handed from a developer onto a tenant, right? And then we have small businesses who are looking to open just a mom and pop shop that again are finding, if they're being compliant, are finding that they are not prepared for the cost and time constraints of getting a permit for their tenant improvements generally, right? That's generally what it comes down to. And then on top of that, where I become sort of interested in if there are programs to incentivize, because we are looking at, I forget what it's called, we're looking at development review strategic plan. We're looking at fee schedule surveys. But what is interesting is how do these things begin to overlay over the long period of time if we're going to create a program, say within a year, 18 months, that that aligns with the general plan update and this idea of neighborhood nodes, the equity overlay considerations, the economic development strategic action plan, which are the second goal of our plan is to design and implement data-driven policies and programs to elevate and support local business owners, social entrepreneurs, representing historically marginalized group. This aligns with the general plan update. And then the interests of the downtown and our economic driver of the downtown. So there's a lot of things that I'm going to ask you to talk about. I'm going to try to guide this conversation, knowing that on the daily, the most questions we have are about tenant improvements. We have limited funds. We have ARPA funds that we're committed to do business facade improvements and murals. We have the opportunity to adjust our existing programmatic budgets to align for future things in the next 12 to 18 months when the general plan is adopted. And then we have equity overlay interests. We also have healthy city interests. So this is a slightly messy way to just sort of open the floor, and I can start asking questions or guiding, but I want to see if you guys have questions about what our objectives are today with this discussion.
Go ahead, John.
Oops, you're on mute.
There we go. I'm sorry about that. So without playing a blame game, is financing improvements, is that the biggest challenge, or is it our lack of ability to turn around applications and permits because of staffing gaps or whatever it might be? What is the most of the various pieces that we're trying to solve? What is the one that seems to be the most challenging, or that puts a roadblock up in front of people who want to locate their businesses in Santa Rosa, regardless of downtown or wherever it might be? Is it a lack of funding that they are challenged with, or is it our processes and our permitting process and our turnaround time that seems to be the biggest brick wall in front of them?
Cadence, you want to take that?
I will happily speak from what I'm hearing downtown. It is the timing. It is the timing.
Cadence, I'm having a hard time hearing you. You're garbled. Sorry about that. Am I the only one that is hearing garbling?
No, it was. I wonder if you need to be closer to the mic.
Is this any better?
Yeah, that's better.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
From downtown business owners and developers, it's the time, it's the length of time it takes to work through the process. So I have to imagine that kind of falls in line with what Jesse was saying for when they end up hitting that ADA requirement and needing to work through that whole process. But I am curious, Jesse, like if you were to look at the last 100 businesses that opened in Santa Rosa, how many fell into like the easy category of just getting their business license? How many were in that middle range that were able to just make some basic level? And then how many kind of triggered the whole triggered working through the ADA process because they were doing more substantial TIs?
Good question. I apologize. I am 3 levels disconnected from permit processing. So I would have to literally go back to a bunch of staff and get that information.
But we can look at that in terms of, we can look at that like if we decide that we do want to look at some other streamlining pieces of it. If it's because I've heard 2 things. I've heard it's time and I can't believe the cost to a certain degree. And it depends on if you're downtown also, and if you're in other areas, and if you're resourced or under-resourced. And if we're looking at, developing programs that would, if there are ideas about developing programs that could be piloted in the downtown, I think that changes it as well in terms of what the issues are. I hear mostly it's time, but I think partly as well, it's not understanding the process and also not being compliant in going through a permitting process. Tara, do you want to take a second and talk about why we didn't do a tenant improvement and some of the issues around that as well?
Sure. Yeah, with the ARPA funds having a kind of a deadline, a timeline for when they need to be associated with projects and then completely used, we felt like it would be a little bit futile to try to attach it to a tenant improvement program because of the length of structuring a program, getting a grant application out there that clearly outlined all the requirements that businesses would have to follow, and if they were doing tenant improvements, and if it triggered additional requirements such as the ADA upgrades and all of the licensed design professionals that would need to be involved in the project. So mainly the time constraint due to the funding source was the reason that we shifted to facade improvements, which can be done through a quicker process, minor design review, less permitting, no ADA triggers, things like that, make it more streamlined. So that's the direction we headed with that grant program. It will still include the mural or public art component, because again, outdoors on exterior of buildings, and murals are kind of exempt from other design review since they're considered art, public art, rather than a sign. So that's a streamlined process already through the public art program.
So if we're looking at, just for ease of the conversation, if we're looking at incentivizing recruiting businesses in the downtown, so we have a recruitment program for the downtown, and tenant improvements is one piece of it. You know, the other things that have come up in terms of incentive opportunities or incentive ideas include waiving the business tax for new businesses downtown. Other incentives include, actually, I think that's the only one that's come up. That's or it's waiving fees. It's doing like a downtown overlay to expedite it, almost the way that we have for affordable housing. Like, how do you get a permit request? And this speaks to the timing piece of it. How do you get a permit request for a downtown business elevated in order to get it moving more quickly? And the issues, again, that we're looking at really are specifically vibrancy and using downtown as a model that we can maybe replicate in other areas. And if we do something, is it scalable across the city, one, and is it possible, or is it needed to sort of isolate what we're trying to recruit? So tenant improvements, for example, programs, if we were able to create a program like that, that's not ARPA money, tied to ARPA money, that has sort of timing restrictions. A lot of cities do it only for childcare. Well, we have the facility fund, so we did that. Or they do it only for restaurants, and they do it only for certain uses. So that's one method. But I'm curious too, is are you hearing or seeing other things, or do you have an interest in recruiting other kind of businesses? Go ahead, Victoria.
Thank you. This is all really awesome, and I'm excited to hear from you as well as our business partners who are here today, what specific types of incentivizations would be most effective in drawing downtown and other areas that we identify as priorities, the types of businesses that we want, and also retaining them. To that end, I think that maybe we've talked about it a little bit. I've talked about it with anybody who'll listen, about a program for restaurant businesses in particular. Could we have a rotating liquor license library where the city perhaps purchases something like 5 liquor licenses and then rents them out at below market to restaurateurs for, let's say, like $20,000 a year for 5 years, and then at the 5-year mark, you would have to go and get your own liquor license. But at that point, your restaurant would be well established, and it would then free up a liquor license for another business. And the reason why I've thought about it like this is that then over time, the city would get paid back and could potentially purchase more or use that revenue to invest in other business attraction or retention programs. So that's one thought that I've been having. Another is I'm just interested to hear from both staff and from Peter and Cadence, what types of things could we do that would be most effective, as in bringing the biggest bang for our buck? Is it, reducing, fees and taxes, or is it actually having programs that finance portions of business development? Or is it something that we could use to retain businesses? So, it's not just about attracting, but it's also about retaining businesses, because I think that everybody's heart just kind of falls their stomach a little bit every time, a restaurant closes downtown or somebody doesn't make it, and we know how much they put into it. So that's an open question. I want to make sure that we go with the evidence and not just with, whatever harebrained idea I came up with,
Go ahead, Tim.
Go ahead. Who? Go ahead. Me. Cadence. Yep.
Oh, I do want to piggyback on that, because I think it's really important that we are talking about retaining our businesses. And as the downtown has looked at ways that kind of taking a look at what the biggest issues are that face our current business owners that would make it easier for new businesses to come in and stay. Fast tracking TI permits is definitely top of the list. Looking at our sign permit policy, which Claire and Amy are moving forward with in what seems like a really helpful way. So we're excited to see that get streamlined and simplified, because businesses, not just downtown, but everywhere in Santa Rosa, need to go through a sign permitting process, or should be going through a sign permitting process. We also talked about reducing parking permit fees for downtown, because that's a barrier for employers in the downtown that really only impacts downtown where we have paid parking. So it often incentivizes new office leasing if they can get discounted employee parking, because many of the office tenants choose to pay for their employees' parking, which is a pretty significant expense if you're looking at $80 to $90 an employee per month. And if we want to be trying to fill the empty office spaces here, even in the current office climate, it's important to figure out how we can reduce some of those fees. That is downtown specific. And then the other thing that we've talked about is the potential 5-year suspension of business license fees for new employers in downtown. Again, that doesn't necessarily have to be downtown specific. It's kind of a minimal financial impact to the city, but it's really about the perception of Santa Rosa being business friendly and wanting to see businesses succeed. So I think there are other ideas like that could be fee waivers, they could be incentives, they could be small policy changes like we're seeing with the sign permitting process, that just also help it make it easier for us to talk about how Santa Rosa is business friendly, right? If we get this kind of ability to promote the mid-level TI list, what's a simple thing to do, how to appropriately work through the process without triggering ADA upgrades, that'll also be a really helpful thing to share, to show how the city is trying to help get businesses started quickly, because the time, again, is a big issue. Cost obviously is as well, but I hear time and time again, I did not expect it to take this long, or I thought I was going to be up and running months ago, or I had been planning on having revenue since March, and now here we are in August. So those are the kinds of things that then make it really hard for a business to stay, because they've had months and months where their business plan, had them opening and bringing in customers, and they've just had to keep their doors closed. So giving them the easiest possible way to start is a great way to retain. And then from our perspective in the downtown, when you can get a better mix of retailers and restaurants, you can fill office spaces. That all of that, even if we've got an office that's empty and then all of a sudden they bring in 20 employees, those 20 employees are buying lunch, they're getting their coffee, they're shopping during their lunch breaks, and all of that is going to help our retailers and our restaurants stay open longer. and kind of get their feet under them so that then they can be one of the businesses that's been downtown for 30 or 40 years. So I think kind of the willingness or the appetite of council to get a little creative and figure out what types of changes can be made to make it more sustainable will be really important, because obviously we've got some, and ideally they are making an impact on the greater Santa Rosa community, because when that's healthy, then downtown is healthy. But would love to hear what everyone else thinks as well.
Yeah, so Cadence or Peter, can we pull this back just a little bit and give us an example of a city that's doing it well?
I mean, I know, Peter, I'm curious to hear what you had to say, but I mean, the research that I've done, they're just doing it differently. We're all struggling with some of these same things. And from a city, like from my staff perspective, and like the thing that I always worry about is what if we're already prioritizing affordable housing, and it's taking its toll on like Jesse and his staff, right? Jamming these things out. It's Jesse pointed out to me, it's building, fire, and water, right? So it's not just one impacting one department, but it's multiple. So different cities with different funding sources have different solutions, and none of them are good. So, or none of them are necessarily ideal. Some of them are good, but they may be not hitting the goals, all the goals we're looking for. So what different creative solutions? Peter, I don't know if you had something different.
Well, I appreciate the question and the intent behind it, right? To be able to pick up and transfer over a policy that would be minimal work on staff to get it across the finish line. But Race, I think you're right. I think there's fundamentally places that are doing it right are doing exactly what Cadence said, right? So it isn't a lot of work to waive a fee. It's not a lot of work to guarantee a certain amount of time to get through the process. It isn't a lot of work to incentivize certain industries, right? All of those things can produce results, and it's really up to your council's sort of policy intent or desire to pick one of those things up and run. A really tangible example of the implications of this, just to kind of hit Cadence's point a little bit harder. I mean, Beneficial State Bank is no longer on 4th Street, right? Tom Steyer owns that bank, and it was too expensive for him to get the branch up and running. And so they started off in a hole, and they're no longer here. And that process was, we want as our sign to paint a mural on the side of our building that includes our logo, but is essentially public art. And that took months and months and months and months to get done. And the branch started off in a hole and couldn't make it back out of that. There's a cannabis shop that is, I don't know the exact resolution of it today, but has needed a sign on its front, right? For good reason, good policy reason behind having a sign on a cannabis shop. Totally get it. It's been nearly a year to get approval of that sign. So again, a business that is paying staff, paying rents, paying taxes during that entire time without any ability to generate revenue. If we make it very quick and as minimally expensive as possible, that is not a lot of work to develop a policy around that. And I'd be happy to volunteer chamber resources to go out and do a scan of other jurisdictions to provide an array of options. But fundamentally, it is how expensive is it, hard cost to get through the process, and how long is it going to take to get through the process. And if you can minimize both of those things, the city will end up maximizing its revenue on the back end.
I appreciate that. Thanks. Tara?
Thanks. I was just going to add in some other ideas that I saw when I was researching tenant improvement and facade improvement grant programs in other cities. And I know that that's not the entirety of this conversation, the grant program component of it, but some of the things that other places are doing to help mitigate some of the challenges that small businesses might have with completing a project on their site. Are cities actually hiring or having a pre-approved list of contractors, either design professionals, contractors, sign companies, or other professionals needed to do the work, so that the businesses don't have to go find them and they can just pick from a approved list of businesses or services, and then those people are kind of they already know the city's process. They already know the costs. They can easily navigate that for the business. I think that that's something else we hear, is just that it's so hard to navigate the process sometimes. And so if there's someone who's kind of working for you on your behalf, who's familiar with that process, that can help. So some of those do include as a part of the grant.
Any other questions, John or Victoria? John?
There we go. I have a question and then a comment. The question: Do we use exit interviews outside of our process after someone has gone through it to see what was the most painful and what worked really well? Because it covers a number of different, could potentially deal with a number of different departments. So, but at the end of the day, after the person acquires their permit, assuming that they go through the whole process, they must have some opinions on what worked and what didn't work. And I'm wondering if we actually have any, if we do any exit interviews to our permit, the people that come in looking for permits, or whatever, you know, if it's requiring staff time, what was that? How was that experience? You know, getting real data on the experience of those coming into city halls. I'm curious as to whether we have any kind of exit interviews. And secondly, on the parking issue, our new technologies in the garages I would think, would be able to avail themselves of what is called nesting, and the rather empty top floors of almost every garage in the downtown. I don't think we have any full top floor parking that is not being utilized. And I would think that we could probably come up with a program. It's always been technology and difficulty in getting a nesting program. But now with our new equipment in the garages, at least those garages that are exercising that new equipment, I would think we would be able to come up with a pretty simple program for business or for discounted parking permits. So that's just a comment.
Victoria?
Yes, my question has to do with, so we got some good suggestions from Cadence and Peter, and some of them require staff time, like the sign policy and approval and permitting and so forth. I mean, and some of them require council to invest in things like choosing to reduce fees or license taxes or whatever. But when it comes to the staff time requests or the things that would move things faster through, is this a matter of coming to council and asking for additional staff resources, or is this a matter of coming to us and asking for resources to contract out these services if we were to want to create, like, let's say, like a time certain program? Like if you apply for your business and you do everything that's on this checklist, this is how long it will take. And this is our commitment to you.
So, if I may, because of the council, thank you. The resources that we need to make some of this happen have already been provided by council through their actions, your actions during the budget process and before the official budget process. In other words, resources are allocated. One of the issues we faced is through, I think most of us have heard in the world, it's not only a supply chain issue, it's a resource staffing talent pool issue. My department, my division was authorized a plan reviewer in, I believe, February or March of this year. And that person starts the 22nd of August. So in my humble opinion, we're already, council has already taken steps to address some of these time issues. And I can firsthand tell you that over the last 2 years, time in permit processing has been horrid. Some of the horror stories that both Candace and Peter have heard, they're true. To get, and I won't focus too much on signs, but say your tenant improvements. You may have heard some of the horror stories about the mass exodus in fire prevention. We had one of our key members left in that entire division. That's a key element of these tenant improvements. You heard the horror stories of a mass exodus of planners. We now have 4 brand new planners on board. They all walked into the door about the same time. So they're all about a month in. So again, another resource that we've been allocated to address these issues. Water engineering, another key element of these. Again, retirements, exit, promotions, private side recruitments. Again, that division has been decimated. Again, I just met their newest member who's been on board a week and a half. That again addresses the time issue. There was a period pre-COVID that we would have regularly, I won't go too far in depth here. The biggest issue we have right now with plan reviews for building permits is what I call our queue. There are so many things in our queue that are awaiting our review. Something new comes in, it goes to the bottom of the queue. Pre-COVID, we were able to execute, in my estimation, 30 to 40% of all permits that were issued through the city where someone walked in, did their thing, and walked out with their permit. Now, 95+% of every permit application goes in the queue. So our resources that we now are getting, and I'm executing some initiatives for some solar permitting, things like that, that are going to take these things back out of the queue. The over-the-counter takes it out of the queue. So if we can get those first out of the queue and handled in a relatively short time, say a week or less, those are things that benefit that type of project, say the over-the-counter type of tenant improvement or others. Then with a queue much shorter, that in my estimation, we should be able to reduce by 30 to 40% of the queue. It then takes those tenant improvements that you cannot do over the counter. And there's a threshold that we have to really be reasonable about on what has to go in the queue and has to be reviewed by these 3 departments or more. And they just take too much time. My rule of thumb is if we can execute it in 30 minutes and do a full review between 20 and 30 minutes, we should be able to do that over the counter. When we start getting into heavy elements of accessibility and structural, it just, we can't allocate that resource where it needs to go elsewhere. So to the question, what can we do from the council's perspective? You've already done an awful lot. We're putting the pieces of the puzzle in place as we speak. And then there's the reality of the world. These new planners that we have on board, most of them are fresh out of college. So do they have planning experience? No. Do they have degrees that affect their ability in planning? Absolutely, yes. They're here and they're all bright, and it's amazing to feel the energy from these folks. But again, the pieces are in place to the most part. I hate to say this, give us a chance to get it in operation. We still don't have the full team. I'm excited to say that my division is full for only the second time in 10 years. The people are still not here yet. So again, that's where we're at. We're really at a good jumping off point. And in my opinion, fire has resources now. They've got some staff positions filled. They do have, much like Councilmember Fleming indicated, professional services that they leverage as well. So that combination, fire is really doing well, where honestly, and Chief Lowenthal and I will joke and admit it, that his department was the delay for many of these horror stories we're hearing for the last year and a half to 2 years. It took 4 months to get fairly simple TI permit plan checked and fire because of their resource. So again, too much of a long story, but we are going in the right direction, and I'm confident that we're going to get to a point where we're doing over-the-counter plan reviews in some fashion, still electronically, still using that convenience and not reproduction of paper, helping, save resources, but within a reasonable time frame, a week or less, is really my initial goal, and then finding a way to get that over-the-counter next day. And
Yeah,
I believe we can get there.
I would agree. I think that right now the council has given us the resources we need. I think it's that next step. So we have to get them up and running. I think in combination with also the approval to move forward on the development review, the development fee schedule study that's going forward, and the development review services strategic plan. I think the next step that I got out of this conversation, though, is one, let's focus it on the downtown as a pilot. We could look at what opportunities exist in the downtown. But I think the next steps are discussing with Alan Alton and his team to understand like what the average business taxes are for what sectors of businesses in the downtown. So we can look at office, retail, and restaurant. I think office is interesting because that's where like restaurants are turning over. They might not be successful, and for the individuals, it might be difficult and a heartbreak if it doesn't work, or if it does work, right? Retail, they've had a hard couple of years, less in terms of the brick and mortar, less assistance in some ways. That tends to be very difficult. The trajectory of retail is changing a little bit, so we can look at that. But office becomes a very interesting thing. Those people coming downtown to eat and shop at those places. And I think talking with Alan to dig deeper on the business taxes by sector in the downtown would be interesting. And then to understand also with his team parking opportunities around businesses. So again, if we're looking at a downtown pilot for potential incentives, I think at this point we need to be business sector specific, because it's not just the cost of the resource or staffing time, because I think we can find ways either through our partnerships with the chamber, which we're doing, or others, but it is also the fiscal impacts of incentives, and how do you not negatively affect the health and welfare of the parking district, for example. So how do we see not just the fiscal impact, but the revenue potential if we're looking at a fiscal impact? And I think what I got from this is that we've got a pathway to look at that. I also noted that liquor license library. I mean, it's an interesting concept. Those are the things that you don't see other places. I don't know exactly what that might look like, but we can totally take a look at that. And then the other thing that I want to say is also digging deeper with Jesse on the over-the-counter process. Once he gets his staffing stabilized, again, to see an overlay of the downtown, what's possible? Do we even need to address some of these things? He came up yesterday when we were talking about this with some interesting ideas like pre-applications for tenant improvements for certain kinds of businesses. I mean, we might be able to do something where you take like once a month or something like this, we have like an open process where people can come in and talk to us, so that we're going to them in an open forum and can answer any sort of question. So we can look at programs like that. And then just to finalize this, if there aren't any other questions, and then to go to public comment, I noted the exit interview permit question, which is interesting. But the other piece is, if we pilot something in the downtown, what's interesting to me is other locations to incentivize additional commercial nodes in neighborhoods, and they might be different business specific incentives based on these. So I noted that as well.
Go ahead, Peter, and then I'll come back to you, Victoria.
I just wanted to pick up on that thought from Rice. This is another area that I would love to partner and share the chamber's resources to try to accomplish. We need to increase wages in Santa Rosa and Sonoma County in our employment base, and the real movement on that isn't through regulation, it's through bringing in new high-paying jobs. And so I think that we can find industries we want to encourage, either that are existing or new to Santa Rosa and Sonoma County, identify those areas where you want some economic development and investment, and then go through a similar process like this, identifying what would be attractive to bring up employment from, the South Bay, East Bay Peninsula, where an employment base may already be here or be attractive, but is forced to commute out of Sonoma County or leave Sonoma County to be closer to a job. We can bring those folks back, bring those wages back, bring that economic vitality back, and make Santa Rosa a stronger economic force, and things that align with council's already stated priorities, right? I'm thinking about green technology, right? And advancements in that sector, for example. So I welcome our resources to help further that.
I appreciate that, Peter. Let's go to Victoria.
Thank you. And thank you for your response, Jesse, to my last question. And for everybody else's input. I wanted to go back one thing, which is that, it sounds like there's two pieces that hold things up from a staff resource time, things that are legally required to be checked off by staff, engineering things, fire things, water things, and then things that are because we say so, like signage and stuff. I'm guessing there's no state law that says we have to have a plan checker sign off. I'm wondering if it would be worthwhile, and perhaps it wouldn't save that much time, to bifurcate those two things and turn the ones that are within our purview into ask forgiveness rather than permission situations, so that we could put out a set of standards and say, at some point we'll come and review this, but, make it within these standards. And if you don't run afoul of them, then there's no problem, and then that way you're not held up on that one particular thing. Because I hate to hear of a business, I imagine it's not the only reason they go under, but I hate to hear of a business going under for something like, a sign holdup. I'd just be interested to hear it, if that's would be more burdensome to staff than just getting more people on board, or not.
Yeah, Jesse, do you have something when you say that?
Just a little bit of history that I learned, even well established before I came here. I learned quickly the sign ordinance when I started here, and it's been redone since my time here, was extremely complicated and still is. And signage historically through the city of Santa Rosa, I had a former technician who worked here for 43 years. Signs have been a point of contention that is unimaginable to this group that hasn't been dealing with kind of the downtown for more than 10 to 15 years. Therefore, this sign ordinance is where it is. So just looking back in history, that just to put a little information into the comment, that's knowledge only that I had heard, and we do get quite a few complaints about signs that are actually legal. So that's where some of the history came from on the sign. So just food for thought on the sign. And I was actually eating the pudding, so to speak, when you were saying meet these parameters, put up your sign. But for me, what does that look like a year and a half to 2 years down the road when I still have the same code enforcement staff that can't keep up? Looking at that historically.
Thank you. And that is helpful. I can only imagine how complicated it gets, but and you don't have to answer it now, but just putting it out there that there may be other things that are non-essential for us to be checking over that we could put out standards for. And then, if it becomes a problem later on, we could deal with it. And then there's fewer things that people need to wait for staff to sign off for, fewer resource draws on both ends.
I just note that Councilmember Fleming, that's very much along the lines of the notion of self-certification, right? So if somebody has a paid professional license, bonded, has insurance, has school, academic training and years in the field for something that is not life safety, like a sign, makes a heck of a lot of sense, right? For self-certification, where they can say, I'm putting my professional reputation that I've met the city's standards on this and turned it in. So that is I think a great practical example of how that notion of self-certification could play out in real life.
Okay. If it's okay, for the interest of time, I think I've captured things. So I think what we'll look at and bring back in a future one is streamlining and incentivizing considerations for businesses. It'll be business specific depending on the area, but starting with the downtown. And then I captured a number of opportunities that will follow up with the chamber, Jesse, Alan Alton, and finance on. And then I can begin to sort of frame out an ongoing discussion to try to build out that program or some kind of program. And that program will be considering the objectives of the general plan update, the economic development strategy, placekeeping, healthy cities incentives, all in alignment with council goals. So I think that this helped me, messy conversation helped me kind of figure out what the next steps on the programs might be.
All right. John, do you have another question, or can we go to public comment first?
It is a quick question. I think it's a quick question. Raisa, did you get what you needed as far as recruitment, identifying those sectors, business sectors that we want to encourage, and then how to do that?
You know what, I did in a roundabout way, and I think if we prioritize the downtown, it's very specifically office, but I think we can get into some more details and look deeper into what office businesses look like. And then of course we have retail and restaurants. But when we start laying out opportunities in alignment with the equity, the priority development areas with the general plan update, that's going to look different. And that's where I know the chamber and the city have had discussions around high wage industries, green tech, biotech, and building out our industry sectors. And so we're working in alignment with the chamber, their programs like the SBDC, to try to understand those. I think that'll have to come at a later date. I think I tried to put too much on the plate for today. If we focus on downtown, we understand a little bit better what that looks like. And then the other areas will come at a different time.
Thank you, because I really love Peter's comment about, Santa Rosa becoming an economic force and being who we are and where we are and how long we've been working at trying to get there. I'm hoping it happens before I'm dead. So I'm just kind of, I want to make sure that, that we're on the right track as far as that kind of recruitment.
I mean, to be fair, the economic updates that we get, Santa Rosa and Sonoma County has fared better than so many other places. And we have a surprisingly, because our economy is more diverse than we give it credit for, especially in Santa Rosa, we've done relatively well, but we are striving to do so much better.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, John. Let's go to public comment then on this item. If you have a comment, go ahead and hit the raise hand feature.
We do have a public comment. Just one moment while I share the timer. Actually, we have multiple public comments. The first will be Gregory Farron. Gregory, if you would just confirm your ability to see the screen and introduce yourself.
Yes, I can see the screen, and my name is Gregory Farron. This has been an interesting conversation. I don't usually pay as much attention to the economics of downtown as much as I do the housing, but I want to point out that I'm currently working on trying to figure out a way of helping $170 million worth of ARPA to community agencies and ARPA to the county. I have a huge list of everybody who got money from either funding source. And one of the things some of them need is office space. Some of them are building programs they don't have room for yet. And I want you to be thinking of them. I know Peter is, because he's got a big piece of it, but you need to think, when you think business, nonprofits, because for the first time in anybody's memory in the nonprofit world, there's an expansion of programs. And those programs don't all need office space, but but some of them do. And they don't want to do it chaotically, and they don't want to do it, as sort of the stepchild of an economic subcommittee that, thinks the only thing that ought to be going downtown is restaurants. So I urge you to look at the list of all of the folks. I'll send it to anybody who wants it, who got ARPA or PG&E money, and, ask yourself the question of, do I know these people, and are they thinking about trying to find new office space? Because you may find a lot of them saying yes and not having anybody who helps them. Thank you.
The next speaker will be Gig Haito. Mr. Haito, if you would go ahead and confirm your ability to see the screen and introduce yourself.
Yes, I see the screen.
Thank you.
My name is Gig Haida. I'm resident of Santa Rosa. So yes, this has been quite a complicated discussion. And the way I see it, there's 4 kind of issues here for new businesses. And the 4 are: number 1, the time it takes to get started; number 2, the expense it takes to get started; number 3, the ability to grow the business and to make a profit; and number 4, the ability to sustain the business over a long period of time and reap the benefits of all this investment. So you are all talking about what the city can do to promote all this, which is great. But the city is not the only stakeholder. All of these are businesses, and the chamber is here, which is great. The chamber supports businesses. And so what I'm suggesting is that it's not only the city's responsibility to make all these things happen and to promote good business thriving in Santa Rosa. It's also the business's responsibility. And the first item, when you talk about the time to get started, yeah, well, that is the city staff's responsibility and all the procedures that are necessary. And I hear that, this is quite sophisticated work. You need knowledge, experience, degrees, and so on. But in every profession, there's always some clerical work or some things that can be delegated to someone who doesn't have a degree or a little bit lower position to just help facilitate things as kind of like a paraprofessional or an assistant or something like that. So maybe the department can improve its efficiency by bringing in some lower level people to just get some of the work done quicker. As far as the expenses to start, well, you said how people come in thinking, oh, it's going to cost me 20, 30,000. Next thing you know, it's 200,000. So that's money. Banks need to be a player. The local banks, if they had a program to say, well, if you're starting a new business and you're in this phase where you're not making any money yet, you're just building into it, then we can give you a lower rate. So banks need to be a player and need to participate, maybe at their association meetings or their foundations or however they, meet, or through the chamber. Then the next part, the ability to grow and marketing and all that. Yeah, that's where the chamber comes in. But we're also missing out the landlords. The landlords are making money on this if they have tenants. So they need to be a player, and they need to be able to offer lower tenant rates in the beginning when the business is starting up and not have any customers. So that's another program, again, could be supported through the chamber or whatever. So I'm just saying, diversify the stakeholders, banks, landlords, chamber, business, as well as the city. Thanks.
Thank you. The next speaker will be Eric Fraser. Mr. Fraser, if you confirm your ability to see the timer, and please proceed.
Yes, I can see it. Thank you very much. Thanks for allowing my comments on this item. This has been a very interesting conversation for sure. And I appreciate a lot of the ideas that have come out of it. For instance, Peter's idea, seconded by Reza, of self-certification certainly would help. Also, the idea that John put forward about nesting in the parking structures. And of course, that should be available to residents that are within say 1,000 feet or 2,500 feet as well. But make no mistake though, that typically when you're engaged in an independent business, your foe is government. You're working against government, excessive fees, timelines, so on and so forth. The idea that government is here to help brings no consolation to you growing your business. In fact, it's usually an obstacle. This isn't about the health of businesses or landlords. This money that's burning a hole in your pocket really is about building your patronage, your political patronage. That's why you're so invested in it. It's unfortunate too. We see that as being true. You don't have to look any further than Railroad Square, for instance, where the Chamber of Commerce probably proclaims that 60,000 people went through the visitor center when it was more like 6,000. This is pre-COVID, of course. But if you're a business and you're looking to locate in the Railroad Square area and you're using that fictitious, overestimated, ridiculous number of 60,000, saying, wow, look at all the people that are coming through this 500 square foot building, then you would say, wow, I have a lot of people that are going to go to my business or go to my restaurant, when of course that's ridiculous. And it shouldn't, that type of fraud should not be allowed to continue in any actor, in any part of government. When Peter talks about chamber money, he's talking about tax money that has been siphoned off through the SRTBIA. It's about 80% of their budget. So no, I think most businesses that are of sound mind avoid the chamber like a plague, and for good reason. The complexities of opening and running a business were well explained by GIG, for instance, and they are the major stakeholder. I was curious whether, to John's point, whether exit interviews are done with businesses that leave the area. Like, for instance, it was interesting, the person who owns the comic store attributed their exit to the screw-ups from the Courthouse Square reunification. He said that when Mendocino Avenue was cut off, that it precipitated a drop in this business that was unsustainable. I imagine a lot of businesses leave the downtown area because of the screw-ups that have come by way of permitting and economic development, not because that they've been there to help. Those are the words that people really don't want to hear. But thank you very much for this nonsense.
The next speaker will be Mr. Charles Evans. Mr. Evans, you should be able to speak and just confirm your ability to see the screen.
See the screen? I am Charles Evans. One other area besides permitting that I think gets in the calculation between time and money and a project moving forward or not moving forward is the line that exists between a permitted use in the zoning and a use that requires a minor use permit. And I often have reason to look at that list in various zoning districts. And some of the ones that require a minor use permit really would seem in most cases to fall within what would otherwise just be a permitted use. And why that's important is that if I, in my case, am talking to a tenant about whether they're going to need to get a minor use permit or they are a permitted use, that difference is somewhere north of $5,000 and somewhere in excess of 6 months to the timeline to go through that process. Jesse, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's sort of the dynamics of where you fall in that the requirement for getting a minor use permit, all in addition to everything we've already talked about in terms of getting tenant improvements plans approved and sign ordinance compliance, those type of things all added onto that. I'd also observed that the one other area where time seems to get away from things in the building department is when it involves the other departments. That hopefully is improving now with what Jesse just told us. But from my own experience, when fire gets involved because you're putting in fire sprinklers or modifying your system, or if public works gets involved because you have to connect your new fire sprinkler system to the public water supply, or you need a grease trap downtown restaurants, particularly where you're going to do something in the public right of way, they all have their own timeline. They all have to kind of come back ultimately to a building permit, but it could really add up time-wise. Thank you.
I
All
see
right,
no,
I see no other hands. We'll go ahead and bring it back. John and Victoria, any last minute comments before we go on to the next item?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. A lot of good information. Look forward to the future.
Yeah. We'll move on to item 3.2, which dovetails nicely with the discussion we've already been having. Raisa, do you want to take it away?
Well, that's where we merged it all together. So I apologize. It's not actually a separate issue.
I wasn't sure if there was something specific that you wanted to add to it, or if it was just sort of the general conversation and topic.
No, we went on from the tenant improvement into the targeted thing. And I think, again, what I got was, we'll start with downtown. We'll look at these things. We'll have follow-up conversations with finance and parking and Jesse and Claire.
Yep, that sounds all good to me then. So we'll keep moving to item number 4, departmental report.
Okay, yeah, so just wanted to give you a heads up, or in this public forum, that we have the development fee schedule study or survey. It's either just going out or went out. Jesse, you might help me on this. Did it go out or it's going to go out?
It appears it's going to go out this week. We're finalizing it. It looks like today.
Okay, so what this is, and Jesse, don't go away. What this is it's a review of the actual cost of services compared with the percent of cost at which services should be charged for the fees. So it's a full fee study, and I think the benefit or the interest of that, it coincides. It's a companion effort with the Development Review Services Strategic Business Plan. And that one is looking to align mission, vision, and values of the city's Development Review Services team, and to bring transparency and accountability into the process by adopting or looking at and eventually adopting performance metrics, monitoring and reporting standards, and to align strategic investments and improved services. So again, another thing that's looking to capitalize on all of the other studies that are happening, the general plan update, et cetera. Jesse, do you have anything to add to those two?
I will say that this is yet another element that hasn't come up in the discussion about delays and ambiguity for applicants. One of my primary goals going into this fee study is to help simplify our fee structure and our fee listing, so to speak. Our current fee schedule for planning and economic development alone is approximately 60 pages long. That's extremely unreasonable for not only staff to try and interpret, but let alone public who doesn't understand or may not understand the different moving parts of fees for the services we provide. So many of us in PED are engaging with the consultant and targeting that, along with what Raisa explained is true cost of service. And yet again, hopefully another element that can play into our earlier discussion to simplify and give people more knowledge walking in the door than they would have had ever before. So thank you.
And then the next thing is that I want to update you on is the 2023 minimum wage. So it's going from $15.85 to $17.06. So as you recall, excuse me, it's linked to our rate increases are linked to the Bay Area CPI, which was 7.6 for the period of July through June. And we did not put a cap on it. So to be clear, in 2020, the beginning of 2020, actually, I think it was 2019, it was $15. 2020, we raised it. The CPI was 1.3. It went to $15.20. In 2021, the CPI was 4.3. It went to $15.85. And then now it's 7.6, and we're jumping up to $17.06. Just For reference, last year was interesting, going from 1520 to 1585. Someone internally made the passing comment that that's a huge increase, and this how our business is going to be able to sustain it. We actually got no complaints for the first time ever since we started this on what the wage increase was. I don't know what to predict this year, but my understanding at the minimum wage, very few people are paying minimum wage who would generally pay minimum wage. The exception, of course, is that I know of for a fact, entry-level positions at the city for our seasonal employees. The city has been, the appropriate departments have been notified, and they are building that into their budget. And then coincidentally, the state did put a cap on theirs, but if the CPI was higher than, I don't remember what, I think it was 3.5, then it would, I think their rates increase a little bit. But anyway, state minimum wage is $15.50 or will be $15.50. Peter, did I get that wrong?
No, I think you're right. I was just going to add a contextual point as well. I think the difficulty for businesses is coming in not with the minimum wage rate, right? Because I think you're right on the way that the labor market is right now. Wages are higher. We'll see if that continues, but that's what it is now. The difficulty comes from as you get into the differentiation between an hourly and a salaried employee, and that it's a compaction, but it's yeah, so it's a percentage above that hourly rate turns, and you start to see an increase in salaried employee wages as well. And again, higher wages is good, just generally speaking. I'm not arguing against that, but it becomes very difficult to track at that level, particularly when a position ought to be one or the other, right? And so an employer is faced with dropping a wage, a salary of somebody to make that person hourly now versus keeping them at a salary position. And it gets even more nuanced because you can't do that arbitrarily based on California labor code. And so the complexity isn't just with the increase.
Yeah, 100%. And interesting, we get a few questions about that, but still have not received a lot of complaints about it. At least it sounds like they might be going to the chamber. And those were the only updates that I had just in terms of department report.
John or Victoria, any questions?
No new questions. Thank you.
I have a question. I don't know if this is the appropriate place to the mayor. Would it be possible on future agendas to have a future agenda item at the end of the meeting?
Oh, I think we have. Oh, you know what? I meant to have it and I would like it. And if we can include that on department reports, that would be helpful. I think we meant to have that added and somehow it got dropped.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you. This is great.
Yep. All right, let's go to public comment on departmental reports.
I see no raised hands at this time.
Okay, good. Bring it back. Any last comments, Raisa?
No, but if you have any requests for future agenda items, I would love to take it. I have one that I can share, but I'd love to hear yours. No, Victoria.
Oh, no, I just generally speaking, sometimes things come up and I saw that we didn't have one today and was hoping that in the future we could have them. It wasn't a problem for today.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we've added it back on. It just, I don't know why it wasn't on today, but yes, we will have that. And I can say just to finish up the department report, because I can add this onto that. I had a very good discussion with Beatrice on this topic on vibrancy and versus healthy city. And so we'll incorporate this in a future agenda item as well, related to this discussion today.
All right, John.
Thanks, Mayor. A quick question, Raisa. And this is actually, it's downtown and it's also economic development. Could we get, and I'm not sure which subcommittee should be living in, maybe both, an update on the parklets program, where who's taking advantage of it? What's the success rate? I guess is what I'm looking for, and where we stand with that topic.
Okay, yeah, we'll put that on one of the agendas.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. With that, I'll say thank you. And we'll go ahead and adjourn today's meeting, and I'll see you all at the council meeting later.
Thanks so much.